thank you everyone for coming. I am so excited to do a reprise of our panel that we had on our first night of Venture Cafe. So 100 Venture Cafes later, the first night was definitely one of those nights where people said, before we started Venture Cafe, you're going to do 5 hours of programming every single week. You're crazy. How are you possibly going to do that? And I have to say that, quite honestly, I think it's because of lots of the folks that are on this panel that we've been able to actually have 100 nights of programming thus far over the course of the last 2 years, and really with the goal of growing our innovation ecosystem in Philadelphia. And I'm delighted. I didn't get to share the stage, the virtual stage this time, but with this esteemed group last time. But I'm delighted that I am able to have a conversation with Bruce Katz, and Nevins, Jabari Jones, and Jeff Hornstein. Jabari, actually, in true transparency, we asked him to be on the panel and he wasn't able to make it for the first Venture Cafe. So we're really excited that he's able to make it for number 100, despite the fact that he's been back many times. So I'm going to ask each of you, because I think you will always introduce yourselves the best, just to tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, and then why you believe we as Philadelphians can really recover and do that in a way that is an equitable recovery. Bruce, you're to my right, so I'm going to start with you if you don't mind.
Great, Tracy. It's great to be here with everyone. And so I'm Bruce Katz. I run the Nowak Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University that was named in honor of my close friend, Jeremy Nowak, co-author with me of the New Localism, founder of the Reinvestment Fund, agitator of the First Order. I think what I've been working on with other cities around the US, and partly with Philadelphia, is how to respond to what is essentially a small business-led contraction, right? Because of the global pandemic, because of the public health lockdowns, all of which makes sense, small business, consumer-facing businesses, Main Street businesses have been disproportionately affected. But there's been disparate impact on Black and Brown-owned businesses because they tend to be highly concentrated in certain parts of the economy that tend to have lower revenues and tend to be underbanked and not quite connected to the mainstream financial institutions, which were the main vehicle for sending federal relief loans down to cities, metropolitan areas, and the rest of the country. So what we are intensely focused on at Drexel and the Nowak Lab is essentially designing and help delivering recovery playbooks that, in President-elect Biden's terminology, says, let's build back better, right? I mean, pre-COVID, frankly, Black and Brown-owned businesses were not at the scale, at the size, in the sectors that need to be if we're going to truly build community wealth. Why can Philadelphia do this? I frankly think Philadelphia could lead the country on this, partly because of the people on the call and others. I mean, you've got probably the strongest network of practitioners, intermediaries, financial institutions across all the elements of a small business ecosystem, whether it's what Jeff is doing around supplier diversity, or Ann's doing around capital access, or Jabari's doing around commercial corridor regeneration, skills initiatives, et cetera. You've got just an amazing team in Philadelphia. If we could cohere it, build up capacity, give it the capital it needs on steroids, Philly could lead the country. And so this is a very particular moment in the nation's history. We could come out of this stronger, but man, it's going to need intentionality and purpose. It's not just going to happen irrespective of what Congress does in the next 48 hours or whatever. We're going to have to, at the ground level, local level, city and metropolitan level, harness all of our energies. So I think that's what I'm doing, but it's COVID land, so day-to-day basis, you never know.
Thank you, Bruce. And why don't you just tell us a little about who you are and what your last couple months have looked like?
Thanks, Tracy. And I'm really, really glad that Bruce went first, because I feel like he hit it out of the park in terms of describing what I think, my other co-panelists and I probably all hope that we can lead Philadelphia toward. But just by way of introduction to everybody, I'm Bovard Nevins, and I am the president of PIDC. I took on that role starting at the end of January of 2020. So the last 10 months or so have definitely felt like 10 years. But I am, really just so proud of our team when I look back at all the things that have been done over those last months. And, we really have focused around a 4 sort of phase approach to an equitable economic recovery in Philadelphia. This is something that we've, been talking about now probably for the last 6 months or so. Between PIDC, the city of Philadelphia, our partners in the workforce universe at Philadelphia Works. And the 4 phases are respond, restart, recharge, and reimagine. And what I think, we talked about from the beginning, but is really important for the moment that we're in right now, is that we sort of said at the outset that these phases are not linear. So there's not, kind of we get through one and then into the next, and then, from there. That may, be the case for sort of a limited, amount or a limited subset of our communities. But for most of the kinds of clients and work that we're trying to support, we are really in and out of almost every one of those phases on any given day. I gave a board presentation earlier this week that looked at adding up kind of all of the investments that have been made so far this year in grant resources through a variety of programs that we've administered, and loan resources, and some of the other things that we've done. And when you look kind of at the map and all the dots, it becomes like just a confetti all over the city, which is really, I think, which is really great to see the scale. But what was a little what was a little striking to me in looking at that is that despite the scale of the work that's been done and the resources, just based on what we've deployed across the city, how much need there still is. And I think this is, to Bruce's point about, next phases of significant intervention, capital needs at a scale that we've never seen before, is really going to be what is necessary to move us all out of this and take our economy, and particularly our small business economy and our Black and Brown owned businesses within that, to a new trajectory and a different trajectory, and hopefully a better trajectory than what we were on before. And I know we'll talk more about some of the specifics of what that need might be and what that might look like. So I'll just leave it there.
That's great. Thank you, Anne. Jabari, you're next on my screen. So if you would like to introduce yourself, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for having me. So my name is Jabari Jones. I'm the president of the West Philadelphia Corridor Collaborative. We are the largest coalition of small businesses here in West Philly, with a membership that includes 14 business member organizations that represent 12 very distinct and very diverse commercial corridor shopping districts. And so my job has been pretty much figuring out how we can advance entrepreneurship from the lens of not only how do we help residents that are in surrounding West Philadelphia neighborhoods that may have ideas for new products, services, and businesses, launch those enterprises and make sure they have the resources and foundation that they need in order to be successful at that launch. And then also about how do we help our existing businesses, be able to scale, grow, thrive, and hire by providing the right representation, connection opportunities, and sometimes the support to be competitive as they move forward on that process. I guess during this year has been an extremely challenging year, as my fellow panelists have kind of been alluding to, and from a commercial corridor management perspective, there have been a lot of needs and there have been a lot of crises. And I think one of the things that we've learned throughout this period is that how important it is to have conversations on crisis prevention and crisis mitigation. And this is something that a lot of folks don't necessarily put a lot of time into when things are going great, but when things are going wrong, it's like, oh man, we really should have in retrospect looked at this. And so I think one of the reasons why I'm very optimistic about the future in terms of what Philadelphia has the capacity to do, not only because of the local leaders that exist in this ecosystem, but also that I've seen it. Like as crises have been hitting our district repeatedly over the course of this last year, we've been a part of it, and we've seen other people that have been a part of forming these very broad-based coalitions and actually coming up with very tangible solutions to immediate problems. And seeing that, seeing the type of innovation that's come in, seeing how quickly people are able to dissect some of these problems and challenges and look at the lens of how we solve those, and also seeing the coalition themselves be more and more diverse in their perspectives and the people that are at the table, and it's not always the traditional same people that you see in every room, and there's some more interest and people with different backgrounds. That's how I'm sure that we'll get to an inclusive recovery.
Thanks, Jabari. Jeff, would you please introduce yourself?
Be glad to. Thanks, Tracy, for inviting me to do this again. Still can't believe it was 100 sessions later. I think it was November 29th was the first one. So
2018.
Wow. What I like to say is that the pandemic really didn't teach us anything we didn't already know, but it's shown a huge Klieg light on longstanding racial inequities and inequalities in our city, our region, the country, the world. I think, now even Republicans will say the word systemic racism, which, there's a serious allergy to. I don't know how seriously a lot they take it, but at least they'll say the words. I think in Philadelphia, the thing that gives me the greatest sense of optimism is working with the leaders of our large anchor institutions, not only the eds and meds, but also the large corporations. And we pulled together a group this summer to do a procurement sort of roundtable where we got folks to make real commitments to shift spend to local Black and Brown owned businesses underneath our PAGE initiative, Philadelphia Anchors for Growth and Equity. And the interesting thing is that people are now coming to us and saying, how do we get involved? Independence Blue Cross just joined our table. Comcast is at the table now. Aramark is at the table. So it's not just the hospitals and universities. We're seeing leadership in the corporate and nonprofit sector that's really pretty remarkable and pretty unique. And Bruce and I have had this conversation a few times about how things are kind of coming together. We're starting to attract philanthropic capital that hasn't existed before. The federal government is supporting some of what we're doing around access to capital. The Barra Foundation just gave us a big grant to support what we're calling Page Prep, which will be a sort of boutique consulting operation to make sure our local Black and Brown owned businesses get the support they need. But anyway, I'm Jeff. I run the Economy League. We're a 111-year-old think and do tank. And I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. I'm going to take us back just a step. So last time we were together, it was the week that it was announced that we did not get HQ2. We did not get Amazon's second headquarters. And I'm curious, if we think back to February, so prior to the pandemic really hitting Philadelphia, how each of you thought we were doing post not getting HQ2. There was certainly many emotions around not getting it. I think the general sentiment was generally okay, that we thought we were okay that we didn't get it and that we had learned to better cooperate with each other. But I'm curious, in the 14 months prior to the pandemic, how did you think we were doing as a city at that point? And I'll start with Anne, actually.
Sure. I mean, I think, to me, just going back to the not getting HQ2 and I don't know, I'm trying to remember even back to what I said at the time that we were last discussing this. But, to me, maybe with some additional time to reflect, I still feel like, there was a lot that Philadelphia had to offer for that opportunity. And I think, it was interesting. Some of what I started to hear, after the fact was almost like the relief of like, oh, wasn't it great that that thing didn't come here or that we didn't get that? And I still don't agree with that assessment. I still feel like as an economy, as a business community, including small businesses, including Black and Brown owned businesses, including our residents with opportunities for education and workforce development and access to high quality job opportunities over a 10 to 15 year span, with protections in place, with time to plan for issues around affordable housing, knowing that significant new tax revenues were being generated that could be reinvested in the protections that would be necessary to ensure that residents and communities were protected. I still think that we would have been better off had we gotten that opportunity. So I do feel like that's something that kind of started to come up maybe later, where I would hear that and I would say, well, wait a minute. And like, no, I don't feel like a big relief. But, getting back to your question, Tracy, in terms of how were we doing? I mean, I think, obviously that we were seeing prior to the pandemic job levels in terms of overall numbers in Philadelphia that we hadn't seen since the early 1990s, maybe even 1989. I think we had maybe gotten back to for 1 month. And yet at the same time, we have not made in all that time substantial progress around Philadelphia's poverty rate. And I think some of the research that was coming out even at that time back in maybe January, February, that talked about looking at the growth that we had seen in Philadelphia's job base and our economy, and the fact that that was really centered around low wage jobs, and some growth at the high wage as well, but really lagging behind in the middle, where there are opportunities for advancement, opportunities, in theory, at least, to move from low wage occupations into opportunity occupations for higher wages. Those were the kinds of jobs that we were not creating at the same pace as our peer cities, or at the same pace even in other parts of the region. So, that I would say is something that was a red flag, to me, even before the pandemic. And I certainly think, like to what Jeff said, like the pandemic didn't necessarily, tell us anything that we didn't already know, but it has amplified, accelerated, and made, significantly worse a lot of the disparities that we already had been seeing. So, I think, that was something that already was an area that needed focus. And I think even more so coming out of the pandemic, how do we focus on creating those job opportunities? And, ideally pairing that with the opportunity to grow Black and Brown owned businesses that are in the industry sectors that are the most likely also to grow those middle wage, middle income, or quality jobs. So I think we can kind of focus on pairing those together. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question.
That's okay. That's terrific. Did you have, Jeff, did you want to jump in?
I would, because what I have to say kind of riffs on what Anne had to say.
Okay, please.
And super sharp analysis. I mean, like Anne, I don't have a lot of patience for the anti-Amazon agitators. It's kind of the height of arrogance to reject 50,000 jobs in a city with with structural unemployment in communities of color that's 40 or 50%, if we're honest about it. And especially the huge induced growth and indirect growth potential from that, sort of transformative investment. Nevertheless, I think we were on a pretty good trajectory. I think our fundamentals are still strong. Restaurants are still opening even in this crisis. I don't know how they're going to survive, but I think the fundamentals are strong. Philadelphia is still an attractive place for people to live and to work and to set up businesses. And there's a lot of interesting real estate development going on right now, as I'm sure Ann could talk more about than I can. But I think there's really a lot of cool projects that are happening, and not just in the normal places, the usual places. I worry about I worry about fragmentation and duplication of efforts. There's so much ferment right now about supporting Black and brown businesses, and so much of it is kind of ill-informed and not really kind of grounded in sort of the need and the demand analysis. One of the things that we do at the Economy League is really just follow the data, right? We've got all the anchor institutions giving us their spend, and we're trying to figure out where the opportunities for growth are and really getting businesses kind of aligned there. I will say one thing. We just put out these weekly briefs. Now they've gone to biweekly leading indicators, and we put one out yesterday. Maybe it was today. What day is today? Thursday. It was yesterday.
Today.
That the poverty numbers have actually gone down. If you look at the ACS just did this very granular data dump from 2005 to 2019, and of course, post-pandemic it's going to look worse, but the poverty rate has gone down in the city, and particularly Black poverty has gone down fairly significantly, and not that we should be very happy and excited. It's still awful. It's still unconscionable. It's more, our poverty rate is more a function that we don't keep as many middle and upper middle class folks in the city as we should be, right? It's not like the number of people in poverty is going up. It's that the number of people who are, middle and upper income continues to leave. And that points to what Ann was talking about, the growth in low wage occupations that, really we should be focusing a lot of our efforts on. So I'm still pretty bullish on the city. I think, with the concentration of large institutions we have here that really are making some big investments, I think we're going to bounce back. I wrote a piece that sort of the end of the pandemic is going to be like an end of a long Scandinavian winter, right? I'm not one of these people who thinks everybody's going to work from home forever. I think the office sector will eventually snap back because, the whole reason people live in cities is to see each other and to congregate and to share ideas and stuff. And I think that's going to happen.
I would love to hop in, actually. So I guess to both Ann and Jeff's point, I remember very vividly the HQ2 process, because 2 of the sites were proposed to be in our district. And I love the energy of so many people that came together to put together the Philly Delivers website, and really they promoted and advertised all of these amazing assets that the city has to offer. And it was really great. I loved it. And I love the energy, and I love some of the things and communities getting together and people really highlighting a lot of the people that contribute daily to the culture of our city. And then when we didn't receive the HQ2, one of the things that I think it caused us and everybody to do is to really take a hard look at this. We came up with all these great things of why you would choose Philly. But then when you look at those things and then you say, well, wait a minute, if we have all these things, why do we have the same problems that we have? And one of the stats that I always point to is that the region has 105 academic institutions and universities, and yet we have close to a 28% bachelor's degree attainment. So where's the alignment of resources and the assets of the region to the issues? And so I thought that one of the things that would come out of that process is that the city and other stakeholders would kind of take a hard look at, look at these amazing assets that we have here in this region and this city. And then why is that not better aligned to some of the challenges that are had here? And I kind of have felt a little bit to a degree before the pandemic, a little bit disappointed about the urgency that kind of came about looking at that. I think that, the city leaders should have taken a little bit of a harder look at that and said, why we didn't get that, and looking at the issues in our workforce and looking at the issues in our poverty rates and education and things of that nature. We should be putting more of a priority on addressing these things, especially since we've worked so hard to identify all of these amazing assets that make this region really amazing. That being said, though, I still believe in the capacity of the region to come out of this and continue to be strong, because there are some folks that have taken that and are still very committed to the work of trying to improve some of these chronic problems that Philadelphia has. But I also think that we also need to be, to an extent, realistic of really realizing the issues and problems, and also noticing that even during that report and that period, a lot of the great things that are happening in this city were happening then, but the investment seems to never be aligned. And the last example that I have, and I was on a call earlier this morning that was kind of really concerning to me. I was on a call for a city project, and there were a number of firms that were on that call that were going to be looking to bid for that project. And there was a firm from Charlottesville that literally came on the call and said, "Is there a local preference for local companies?" And the folks from the city said no. And I'm like, that's the main problem. Like, how much money that you have, dollars that the city government institutions directly control that are leaving the city and going to firms and projects that don't economically benefit to this ecosystem at all. And it's not like we don't have the resources here, because the resources are all here. It's about where's the conscious shift, especially knowing everything that's happening right now, to say, instead of putting our dollars to contract with a firm that's based 6 states away, let's see if we can invest those dollars in the actual neighborhoods that are here in Philadelphia that are going to promote local hiring and local jobs and grow local businesses.
Thank you.
Tracy, okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, all I'm going to add to this is, the knock on Philly from the outside, maybe from the inside as well, is this is a city and metropolis that is unbelievably rich in assets, but has never really been able to collaborate to compete or connect to compete. And so the Amazon HQ2 competition, the beauty contest, which in some ways represents the worst of the pre-COVID economy, right? I mean, let's have a beauty contest. Let's get every city and metro to spend $1 gazillion, right? And at the end, we'll pick New York and Washington. I mean, give me a break, right? I mean, the presidential election was not rigged. This competition seemed like it was rigged, frankly, from the beginning. But that aside, I think what you now have is like the muscle memory of collaboration, right? Mm-hmm. And the cities and metros that are going to come out of this COVID pandemic better are those that are going to be able to knit themselves together, compete for whatever federal resources are available. I mean, we'll see what happens, right? There could be a major infrastructure bill. We're finally going to see another big investment in unemployment and small business and vaccine distribution. But the places that are going to succeed are those that really use this to build the strongest ecosystems imaginable around small business, upskilling, community wealth, neighborhood regeneration. And I think Philly's got the possibility. So just take HQ2 and that surge of collaboration and apply it to what comes next.
Bruce, I was actually going to direct the next question to you. In September, you and Richard Florida had written an article, Building Philadelphia Back Better, the road back for inclusive and resilient recovery. And to a certain extent, it felt very much like a blueprint. You laid a blueprint out for the city to say, here's what in September you thought we should do. Can you give us a sense for how you feel now, 3 months later, as to whether that blueprint is still viable? Are we working on it? Is there something you would do differently? And kind of what are the salient points?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thanks for that characterization. I would say when we wrote that, we thought we might be able to see the end of the pandemic and not this surge in the late winter. And we presumed that Congress would actually have passed a relief package in the fall, right? But they decided to commit an act of national malpractice and left the building, literally. So finally, it looks like we're going to get something. But I think what we've learned over the past several months, and I've talked to Rich about it, is how do you stage and sequence? Because it goes back to our earlier conversations. This is a small business-led recession. And cities, what really makes cities great are those locally owned enterprises, right? I mean, when Jane Jacobs wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities, it was about having that authentic, customized set of businesses, so that folks understood they were in Philly, right? It's a certain kind of food, it's a certain kind of attitude, it's a certain kind of grit, right? So I think, my change to what we did, several months ago is stage and sequence. 2 of those 7 efforts, maybe 3 fit right now. They're the crisis response, right? How do you stabilize Black and brown-owned businesses, and how do you help them restart, and how do you accelerate the regeneration of these commercial corridors and business districts and main streets? Then we get to the recovery bit. And hopefully with some intelligent counter-cyclical investments in innovation, infrastructure, and human capital. If the federal government can act, can play their role, it's their role. That's what they're supposed to do in our system. Philadelphia can benefit immensely because you've got the assets primed for unlocking. So I still think what we wrote several months ago, September 3rd, makes sense. But now it's a staging and sequence. We have a burning platform around small business, and then we sort of transition and really, again, build that muscle memory of collaboration, connection across this incredible ecosystem, and then do what it means to grow the kind of quality jobs on steroids that have an inclusive impact.
Thank you. And I know the work that you've been doing with PIDC has really been in this area, and you've been doing a significant amount of research on the ecosystem. What do you think are the most critical needs to support the growth of Black and brown businesses as we're coming out of the pandemic?
Thanks, Tracy. I will speak to a couple of things, but I want to go back actually to the point that Jabari was making about the need for that type of deeper and sustained collaboration. That I think, he is right that there was not coming out of the Amazon process the same sort of level of urgency around certain key things as was seen during the process. And I think that that's something that, get caught back up in the day to day, and it's easy for, that to sort of dissipate if you don't have the sort of structural fabric in place to keep it together. So I think that is something that we really need to take a lesson from in this current crisis and not kind of let that happen, where I think there are really some exciting and strong partnerships forming within the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And even just figuring out, how do we sustain those partnerships is maybe one key piece of the puzzle before we get to what are some of the resources and some of the other, like the maybe even more tangible things that are missing. I think one example that I would give of that is the Pennsylvania CDFI network and the coalition of in the statewide small business assistance program, 17 community development financial institutions across Pennsylvania that came together in one network with one single application with one portal locally developed by a Black-owned business here in Philadelphia, by the way, that was able to execute on the disbursement of $225 million worth of state resources to support small businesses, 50% of which was dedicated to historically disadvantaged businesses, and which was designed as a program to really reach and serve those small businesses that had been the most impacted based on the knowledge and perspective and kind of on the ground view of those 17 member CDFIs. Of the 17, there's 11 that serve Philadelphia. And so we're, working together and have been working together as a collaborative, since the early stages of the pandemic, kind of just coordinating, like, what are you doing? What are you hearing? What can we, what can we do to help each other? But I think that now we're sort of at a point where we need to figure out, can we take this momentum that has been developed through the statewide program and also the City Cares Act funding that is about $37 million that's flowing through that same program. And Bruce, I don't know, I mean, I you tell us if this is like a national model that we should be, touting as yet another Philadelphia and I guess Pennsylvania, first. But I think figuring out how do we leverage that type of a network on an ongoing basis going forward, and leverage the power of coming together as a network to bring resources at scale. There is no way that even if all 17 organizations did their best and, scraped the bottom of the barrel, that together we would have even been able to come anywhere close to $225 million, or, ultimately with different county funding put in, it'll probably be more like $300 million across the state. We never would have been able to do that as an individual 17 organizations. We were only able to do that as a network. So I think that's just one example. Sorry, Tracy, that's like less to your question of some of the specifics of like what are some of the things that are needed to be done. But that's more about like what's the infrastructure that we need. And I think that it's partnerships like that and figuring out how to sustain them. So it's not that we just came together in that crisis, we did an amazing job, we got that, hundreds of millions of dollars out the door, and then we never do it again or never do anything like that again. I think that's like, to Jabari's point, like what we don't want to have happen coming out of this. How do we sustain it?
Right. Jeff, I think you might have some thoughts that you want to share as well.
So not to sound totally self-serving, but I think the page model that we're building is exactly that kind of durable infrastructure, right? So we asked each anchor institution to give us initially a 3-year commitment to help us build a runway and build a platform for them to collaborate. And they've seen the value in it, so they've all re-upped, and now we have a 5-year commitment, trying to see if the city's going to stay in as a partner under the financial crisis that now exists, but hopefully going to meet with Mike Rashid in a couple days and figure that out. But we're trying to stay in this very particular lane, which is institutional purchase, right? And to the point earlier of walking the walk, we just signed an agreement with Stimulus, Tiffany Stannard, who's this brilliant serial entrepreneur who developed a Stimulus platform, which is going to exponentially increase our ability for our procurement directors at the anchor institutions and small businesses to find each other, for us to do the data analytics and understand what the ecosystem is. We analyzed $2 billion worth of spending data this summer, and it was depressing that only about 11.5% of that spend was done with local and diverse firms. And we purposely picked categories where we knew there was local local opportunities. So we're hammering away at the culture of procurement, in which procurement directors are, oh, we don't want to break our long-standing relationships. I had a very frustrating conversation with a senior person at a big institution about how they a long-standing relationship with a firm that's not even an American firm, let alone local. And I said, well, the term long-standing relationship is sort of the definition of structural racism, right? You know, if you're not willing to change the way you do business to privilege and to give access to local firms, then you are part of the problem. So the infrastructure we're building now is coalescing, right? It's going to coalesce into a durable thing that once this 5-year pilot is over, I'm pretty confident that all of these institutions are going to sort of subscribe for $50,000 a year. And we're going to continue to create a pipeline of businesses that can meet their needs in an ever escalating way. So if now we're at 11.5%, we ramped that up to 15%, 20%, 25%, 30% over time. And what the goal is here is to create local enterprises that are not just local enterprises, but they're traded enterprises, right? So EMSCO Scientific is probably our big success story right now. You know, they're hopefully about to break ground on a building next week, but they, and Ann can speak to that much better than I can, but they're raking in the contracts now because Penn validated them as a supplier, then CHOP, then Jefferson, now Temple. And so they're going to be in a position where they can import capital from other places to fund Philly jobs. And that's what real growth is about. So, you know, again, not to sound totally self-serving, but we think Page is one platform that is going to allow us to have sustained growth in a value add way that's, you know, that our participants are going to want to pay for.
So Jeff, I had the privilege of participating in the Economy League's GPLEX, and I will absolutely bastardize this piece of data that the keynote speaker on the first day talked about, but she was talking about how in many neighborhoods, folks come home, they earn their wages, and you know it takes exponential number of days for it to be spent, and generally it's spent kind of in their neighborhoods, and that's not happening kind of in the neighborhoods in Philadelphia, in the neighborhoods for Black-owned businesses in some of our neighborhoods in Philadelphia. And so Jabari, I kind of see you as a representative of kind of Main Street, and tell us what's happening from your perspective and what it looks like in terms of recovery. And obviously, when Bruce and Richard wrote their article, they were talking about how, you know, Main Street recovery is absolutely critical for what Philadelphia needs to do as we emerge from this pandemic, and if we expect and hope to have an equitable future.
Yeah, so absolutely, I 100% agree with that. And I always say that commercial corridors are the skeletons of neighborhoods. They're the literally backbone of a lot of these communities, especially here in West Philly. So right now you have a lot of these major commercial corridor Main Street areas have been significantly affected over the past year. You know, you've had government ordered closures that resulted from COVID-19. You've had 2 rounds of civil unrest that has caused significant property damage, inventory damage, you know, and in general made you know, more expensive for some business owners. You've also had a level of tropical storm flooding that happened in the southwestern corner of our area that still, unfortunately, still has damage that's been unaddressed in many cases. So. And then on top of all of that, you've had these businesses that have not been able to generate any revenue for 6 to 8 months. And so the problems have been, there's no money coming in, but my expenses are increasing, and there's all these other things that are happening that are now making it more and more expensive. And there's also a level of uncertainty on the government guidelines that are issued as it comes to reopening. And so a lot of businesses are on the fence in terms of whether they're going to be able to pull through and survive, or whether they're going to fall out and have to close. And there's a lot of businesses that have pretty much just stopped checking the bills, so to speak, because they know they've deferred all sorts of expenses throughout this pandemic. One of the biggest things that I think businesses need to really be able to do, and this is beyond some of the stimulus and aid stuff, is we have to figure out ways to make sure that businesses can continue to generate revenue. Stimuluses are great, but they're temporary band-aids to the problem. They help you survive for a month or 2 months or 3 months, but as the pandemic continues and businesses aren't generating revenue, the bills are still due, and eventually you fall into the same kind of slump. And so figuring out, one of the things the collaborative is working on now is trying to figure out what that next large push for e-commerce is going to be. You know, how do we connect our retail businesses to shipping and logistics and digital marketing capabilities so that they can sell their products even when there's no foot traffic, even when there's no consumer traffic, even when they can't have people in their physical stores because of, you know, what's happening with COVID and the city's, you know, city and states regulations being a big thing. And then the other thing I think that needs to be continually addressed, as a lot of folks have kind of noticed, has been looking at some of the recovery initiatives and some of the text on those recovery initiatives that have barred businesses from being able to participate. Now, some of that, of course, is on businesses, because there have been businesses that have gotten comfortable operating in a certain way that is not the way of a legitimate business person, and they haven't been doing, you know, some of the steps, and some of them can be chalked up to people just not knowing, to people not having the resource or not seeing the outlet to get the information that they need. But in any regards, there have been businesses that have been operating certain ways, and those ways that they've operated have kind of debarred them from being able to participate, you know, even in the amazing statewide grant program that, you know, Ann was mentioning. You still had to be able to produce some documentation. And if businesses were not doing that, or weren't able to validate certain things, or they didn't legally incorporate the right way, then they ended up being met with these problems when it came to doing that. So we have to also figure out, as we talk about inclusiveness, you know, we have to figure out ways to make sure that businesses are ready. And then we also have to make sure that any legislation or relief money or programs that are going to come out to help these businesses don't have text in it that is going to bar these businesses from participating. You know, that a lot of the federal relief programs in CARES Act 1 had these regulations that stopped that anybody who has ever committed a felony from being able to participate in any of those programs. There were things that on the definition of, you know, businesses that had and industries that tended to use more contract labor than employee labor were set at a disadvantage for some programs that required you to have traditional employees. So we have to really have the lens of small businesses at the table. And one of the things that I always advocate for, especially when we're surrounded by research folks, is to make sure that your research is inclusive and make sure that you are, you know, opening up to everyone to participate in those coalitions that are having, even people that are non-traditional researchers who may not have a research background but have run a business for a certain number of years and can give you, like, this is what it really is like on the ground for me and my business to be able to do this. And we've seen some coalitions are getting broader, and I'd love to see more and more people at the table. And I've been seeing a lot of people being added to that. So we really just have to keep that up, and also keep up on our elected officials that, you know, when the time comes for legislative matters, that, you know, they have those same coalitions in mind when they're, you know, bouncing around these ideas.
I love that idea, Jabari, and it was, to me, I saw two kind of big themes that have been emerging throughout the course of the conversation tonight. One has really been around intentionality. And so, you know, in order for us to make sure that our recovery is as robust as it can be and as inclusive as it can be, there needs to be an intentionality associated with it, as well as collaboration. So we saw, you know, kind of post-June, there have been a lot of folks who have been reacting, and as Jeff mentioned earlier, are speaking the term systemic racism maybe for the first time. How do we bring together those resources so that we're collaborating and in an intentional fashion so that I feel like, for me, one of the biggest takeaways from Philadelphia is there's lots of really great intentioned people that are doing essentially trying to do the same thing, but not necessarily rowing together in the same boat. So how do we kind of learn that history and move forward in a way where we don't repeat that and in fact kind of accelerate our growth because we're working together? And anyone can answer.
Just one thing to put on the table, Tracy. You're a very large metro, you're a very large city, but you don't have a philanthropy that's the size of Lilly in Indianapolis or Heinz in Pittsburgh or Kresge in Detroit, yada, yada. So there's got to be a different way to harness wealth because there needs to be philanthropic, patient, and market level investing in this ecosystem. The feds just rain down loan products. That's what they do, right? SBA is not like a HUD or a DOT. This is not really what the feds do. So increasingly it's private and civic capital that has to build up this ecosystem. You've got a lot of wealth management firms, in the Philadelphia suburbs and in the city. There's got to be a mechanism to unlock a portion of this regional wealth and put it towards this purpose. Otherwise, you're going to have undercapitalized intermediaries. It's not that they don't play well, it's each one of them is just, living hand to mouth.
It's budget season.
Yeah.
I totally agree with Bruce on that. I mean, we don't have a Cleveland Foundation, right? We don't. I mean, so the bright spot to me, and I just got off a call with Next Street earlier today, and Anne is involved in this, is pulling together an ecosystem kind of analysis, and trying to build some coordinating, sign use. I mean, the Economy League was set up to do that, but we're not big enough to really do it for the whole region. So we're picking our lane, but so I think the United Way under the visionary leadership of Boulder is going to try and become that. It's going to try and become the community foundation we wish we had. I mean, it is a shame that William Penn doesn't seem to be willing to play that role because they do have the capital. I mean, they're a big foundation, but by most definitions. They're not quite the Ford Foundation, but they're $5 or $6 billion. That's not the role that they've just decided to play. I mean, they do great investments in the buckets they invest in, but they're not like a community foundation. So it seems to me this ecosystem project, which I was a little skeptical about at first, but my friends from Next Street talked me off the ledge.
They're very smart.
Well, I've known Next Street for a long time, and I respect them. So the fact that they were brought in was cool. I mean, obviously, it would have been good if we had spent local dollars with local firms, but that's another story.
Bain, eConsult, they're in there too.
Yeah. I'll hold my tongue. Yeah, but there's a lot of undercapitalized intermediaries. I mean, I run one of them, but we're getting better capitalized. But it is a big metro, and not having that coordinating center has been a problem. City government has been by default that coordinating center a lot of the time, and that's not the right place for there to be a coordinating center. So I don't know. There's a group of a new group of leaders that are coming together that are trying to think about something. It'll be interesting to see how this all shakes out in the next couple of years.
I think to answer that question, Tracy, is I think that, and this I guess goes a little bit against what I guess is happening here, but I think that in Philly we have a lot of, and sometimes too many coalitions. I think that some coalitions are put together. I think ultimately the idea of forming coalitions is obviously a great idea, but I think that what makes coalitions work is when people that are at the table represent either a specific constituency or interest, and their participation in that system is to, or in that coalition, advances their specific ecosystem. Because what I see a lot of times is I see a lot of folks that might be not necessarily connected to West Philly, or they may not have work that actively works in West Philly, that have a number of conversations that may be about, economic recovery, or even the other thing, which is health and wellness. And they kind of come up with a plan, and this is the help of, this is a real example that happened around the COVID-19 stuff. They kind of put together a plan, and then they didn't have like the community input portion of it. And so because they didn't have that, the community side put together their own coalition. And then now you have two opposing plans, and it's like the health side has the resources, and the community side has the people you're trying to reach. But because the coordination didn't happen at the planning phase, like now the organizations are coming together and they both have their own plan and way they want to do things. And now you're kind of like butting heads. So I think one of the things that's really important is that, especially with, as ecosystem projects come up and we look at the greater, process, I think one of the things that works very well is to have people at the table that represent, either geographically or interest-wise, having both of them at the table from the jump of projects, so that this way that, it's clear we want people to be involved at the very beginning. We don't want to come up with a plan and then bring people a plan. And because people responding to urgency, they end up creating their own thing. And now we have two different projects, and it's like trying to fit two different puzzles together, and it just doesn't end up working.
Yeah, that to me is always kind of one of the biggest challenges, that everybody kind of comes up with their own solution as opposed to coming up with one broader solution. We're running up on time. I would love for each of you to kind of share a parting thought as to what you think we need to do really in order to promote an inclusive recovery. Bruce, do you want to start?
Yeah, look, just building on what everyone said, is this is a small business moment, right? And you actually have a lot of the puzzle pieces. If you can put this together, you're going to be first in class in the United States. I don't think there's any doubt about this. You've got some of the strongest practitioners in the country doing some very significant things. You put all this together, this is going to be 2 + 2 = 5.
And
I hope that's the new math. That's kind of like what I'm learning in virtual kindergarten. That's what my 6-year-old seems to come up with. So maybe it's true. So, I think that I am likewise optimistic in terms of where we can go from here. I think that, we by no means obviously are sort of out of the woods in terms of the public health situation. And I think it's important that we, continue to put people's health and safety at the forefront. And obviously we have to balance that with our focus on the economy. I like a lot where Jabari was going in terms of like what's next in e-commerce and how do we really help people with that supply chain piece of it, the digital piece of it, so that no matter what's happening, that opportunity will to generate revenue will continue to be there. So I think, in terms of what I'm excited about as to how PIDC is thinking about deploying our resources in 2021, is, really focusing on not just a single resource and kind of coming up with, well, what are we going to do over here for small business? And then what are we going to do over there for the Navy Yard? Or, what are we going to do in our contracting, and have those be really separate, kind of things where everybody, who manages those are coming up with their own plan and really taking a much more kind of holistic, focused approach, and, being more explicit about saying that there are things that we need to tackle in Philadelphia and address racial inequity and poverty. And, those aren't really things that we've traditionally talked about directly. in the past. And I think, that's something that we will do and need to do going forward. And then what do we, do in terms of that can cut across all of our resources? To me, focusing on two things of supporting wealth creation, growth, and resilience for our Black and people of color owned businesses and our businesses located in low income communities and that serve our low income communities. And then the second being opportunities to create those quality jobs. I think we still have some work to do to define exactly what we mean by those quality or those middle wage jobs for Philadelphians. And I think if we stay really focused on that across everything that we do, then I think we have great opportunity to, within the limitations of our, resources, to do a lot, and hopefully with Bruce's help and seeing what might come next around federal opportunities, maybe we'll have a lot more resources than we currently do at this moment to work with, which would be really exciting.
Awesome. Jabari, parting thought.
I echo that. I think that the city, I think that we have such a great opportunity here. We have so many great people, so many great thought leaders, and so many great community organizations that are really dedicated to this work. And they have, put together and put everything on the line, so to speak, to engage in, an inclusive recovery. And I believe that all the ingredients are here, but I think that the two things that I think that are just the most important of everything, one is curating conversations like these, Tracy, that bring together, your thought leaders across various industries to kind of share what's going on. And for those conversations to continue, making sure that, you have these diverse, industries or areas that might not even connect with each other, may have a lot of things in common, a lot of information that can be shared. So I think that the best practices, have already been here. Those models have been proven. And I think that if we, make a conscious effort to continue to work together and continue to kind of check in and support each other's work and form the right kinds of coalitions, I think we can, do some really great stuff and bring this back.
We need one big Slack group for all the thought leaders in the city.
All thought leaders, yep.
Jeff, final thoughts.
I'll be the one note, Johnny here, but it riffs on what everyone else is saying. Scale our established firms via institutional supply chain leverage with a focus on Black and brown owned firms. Mobilize the thing we haven't really talked about, but we need to mention, it can't just be CDFIs, it can't just be traditional banks. There's a lot of investment capital sitting on the sidelines, donor advised funds, the family offices that we are all subsidizing with tax breaks. They need to put their capital in motion. And we're hopefully got a plan to start doing that by guilting all those rich people in the suburbs to start investing in the city.
Awesome. Well, thank you all very much. This was certainly a different conversation than we had 100 venture cafes ago, but really incredibly timely. And I appreciate all of your candor, because in order for us to be successful and to move the city forward in the way we want to, it's going to take tough conversations. And so, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting to get a different result. And so we need to make sure that we are having difficult conversations so that we get the result that we want in the future. Natalie, I don't know if you wanted to jump in and it looks like she kind of pushed folks to the next session that's happening already. So thank you again for joining us.
Bye.
Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you.